Hej och varmt välkommen tillbaka. Dorte Bo-Börjesen, VD för Form Design Center. Jag vill också passa på att bjuda välkommen till Arkitekturdagarna med Sveriges arkitekter på Form Design Center. Och design och arkitektur är ju både viktiga verktyg för att skapa god gestaltad livsmiljö. Och det ska vi prata om nu, och därför vill jag välkomna Moderator för det kommande timmes presentationer och samtal på temat Levande Städer, Levande Gator med Daniel Byström. Varmt välkommen upp, Daniel.
Tack så mycket. Så, mitt namn är Daniel Byström och jag är sedan flera år del av styrelsen här på Form Design Center. Sedan ett halvår är jag även anställd som projektledare på Arkdes think tank. Och de flesta känner förmodligen till Arkdes som den nationella mötesplatsen för just arkitektur och design. Arkdes är ett museum men även en myndighet med uppdraget att följa upp genomslaget av politiken för gestaltad livsmiljö. Och det är Arkdes think tank som arbetar med just myndighetsuppdraget. Det är en stor ära att vara här idag på alla vårt älskade Form Design Center och att få vara med på Arkitekturdagarna. Stort tack till alla inblandade. Jag vill även passa på att framhäva vilken förebild Form Design Center verkligen är som regional och nationell nod inom frågor kopplade just till gestaltad livsmiljö. Här samlas aktörer inom arkitektur, form och design. Tillsammans med regionen och staden med korsbefruktning från andra discipliner, forskningsområden. Man samlas med gemensamma mål och man lyfter fram den lokala uppfinningsrikedomen. Man stöttar lokalt hantverk och design. Man blir synliga med goda exempel utåt, nationellt och internationellt. Form Design Center är verkligen en förebild. Det betyder inte att alla regioner i Sverige måste ha just ett Form Design Center, men man behöver ha en egen modell för hur man strukturerar sig inom frågor som berör just gestaltad livsmiljö. Min dröm är just en struktur och ett tätt samarbete mellan bransch, näring och offentlig sektor och akademi. Från den regionella till den nationella nivån. Och framförallt önskar jag att även att se ett mycket tätare samarbete mellan de områden som behandlas i just politiken för gestaltad livsmiljö. Nu ska ni få höra mer om levande städer, levande gator. Och först ut så ska ni få höra Eva Dalman. Eva ska berätta om Brunnshögsprojektet som hon är projektledare för. Det handlar mycket om hur en plats kan planeras i grunden från dialog, samarbete och nyfikenhet. Med önskan att finna nya lösningar för hållbar stadsutveckling. Det låter spännande. Välkommen upp, Eva.
Ja, tack så mycket, Daniel. Jag är också glad att få vara här och berätta om vad vi gör i Lund och i Brunnshög. Gestaltad livsmiljö, ja. Det är lite en knäckfråga för oss givetvis om vi ska skapa levande städer och gator och miljöer. Att vi har en god gestaltad livsmiljö som möjliggör det här. Och vi som är praktiker och jobbar ute i kommunerna, vad har vi då för möjligheter att göra detta? Det tänker jag berätta om. Brunnshög då. En plats för 40 000 människor om 40 år som bor, arbetar eller studerar. Byggena är i full gång, så här ser det ut i Lund nu. En spårväg kommer att invigas till Lucia, så vi kommer att ha en riktigt god kollektivtrafik. Byggkranarna står tätt, människor har flyttat in. Brunnshög är redan en livsmiljö där människors vardag utspelar sig. Det här med vad vi kan göra konkret, vi som jobbar i kommunerna, ja, det är rätt mycket och paletten är bred, speciellt om man jobbar i ett sånt här projekt som täcker både planering och genomförande. Vi gör givetvis planer, vi har samverkan brett med både andra aktörer och med medborgare med mera. Vi arbetar också väldigt aktivt med markanvisningar och försäljning av marken. Vi äger ju marken i Brunnshög i Lunds kommun och det ger ju väldiga möjligheter att påverka den byggda miljön och gestaltningen. En chans vi vill ta. Något som är jätteviktigt om man ska samlas kring en färdriktning vet vi ju alla, det är visionen. Vår vision sattes redan 2012, den är 8 år gammal, den verkar överleva ännu ett tag. Därför att den är så omfattande så vi närmar oss med snigelfart att infria de här visionsmålen. Det gäller att sikta högt om man ska nå högt. Vi kopplade våra mål till FN:s globala och vi har brutit ner hållbarhetsmålen till 3 väldigt enkla meningar då. Minimera, balansera och maximera. Minimera klimatpåverkan är lätt att förstå, det vill vi alla göra och det är en bred samling kring det här visionsmålet. Men jag tror vi kanske har formulerat det lite vassare än de flesta och jag får erkänna att vi vet inte hur vi ska nå det här. Det är verkligen ett visionsmål som ska sporra, som ska göra att människor kommer samman och gemensamt vill lösa utmaningarna. Och eftersom utbildningstiden är lång så kommer mycket hända och jag har gott hopp om att vi faktiskt ska infria och leva upp till det här visionsmålet. Balansera den goda jorden. Vi bygger på bästa jordbruksmark. Växtlighet, blommor, träd är jätteviktiga för upplevelserikedomen i en stadsmiljö. Men det är också en plikt att försöka kompensera den jordbruksmark och de odlingspotential som vi faktiskt bygger bort. Det är att ta ansvar för framtiden. Alla byggrätter som vi har sålt i Brunnshög har haft någon form av odlingstema hittills. Så till sist maximera, vad vill vi se mer av i Brunnshög? Jo, vi vill se mer arkitektur som berör, mer stadsmiljö som aktiverar oss människor, som får oss att känna att vi har möjlighet att påverka och att vi har möjlighet att på något sätt faktiskt växa. Det är stora ord, men det här är ju också visionsmål. Ett sätt att kommunicera de här målen och också komma ner på väldigt konkret nivå är att använda den 3D-studio som vi har till vårt förfogande på Designhögskolan i Lund. Där finns möjligheter att visa vår 3D-animation och vi kan gå dit med grupper och diskutera och samtala och verkligen se hur miljön kommer att bli och få feedback. Det resulterar sen i mer traditionella visionsbilder av den här typen som ju ändå visar ut en riktning både mot medborgare och andra aktörer i projektet i den här breda samverkan. Vad är det för slags stad vi tänker oss? Naturligtvis arbetar vi med planer av olika slag. Dispositionsplanen är det här som visar också intentionen att visa en rik stadsmiljö som har flera strängar på sin lyra. Både gröna kopplingar och mer stadsmiljö. Jag sa att vi jobbar mycket med markanvisningstävlingar och där har vi ett jättebrett spektrum av olika tävlingar med olika metoder. En tävling som jag vill nämna nu eftersom jag talar inför många kollegor är att vi har sålt mark speciellt till arkitekter som vill bygga radhuslängor där varje hus har ett eget ansikte så att man får många ryggar på i bokhyllan med olika utseende. Det här är då för att få mer upplevelserikedom och visa mer god arkitektur. Varje gång vi har sålt mark så tar vi upp diskussionen om ett hållbarhetsöverenskommelse, ett kontrakt som bifogas till köpeavtalet för att binda upp processen och avslutas med att vi stämmer av när vi har slutsamråd och när husen är färdiga. Jag ska inte gå in på dokumentet i detalj. Ni ser här att det är lite olika kolumner. I korthet så är det så att vi i kommunen säger vad vi har för mål, hur vi tänker bidra till måluppfyllelsen med våra åtgärder, och sen ber vi byggaktörerna att fylla i hur de tänker bidra, och sen följs det här upp då vid slutbesiktningen. Speciellt trycker vi på att vi vill ha bidrag från varje projekt i Brunnshög som ska göra livet i stadsdelen mer intressant för de som bor eller besöker området. Men det är byggaktören som själv hittar på vad de vill göra. Vi ger lite exempel. Vi försöker lotsa. Men ytterst så är det ju byggaktörerna som har idéerna och inte vi. Och det här ska då leda till att vi maximerar sinnesintrycken i Brunnshög och får en bred palett av olika lösningar som går långt mycket längre än vad vi som planerare hade kunnat tänka ut på kammaren och kanske ställa krav på. Det är mycket roligare att jobba brett med samverkan och få ta del av andras idéer också. Ja, det var markanvisningar och hållbarhetsavtal. Lunds kommun bygger också fantastiska parker i Brunnshög för att öka möjligheten att få ett underbart liv. Det här är Nobelparken som blir klar i vår i april, så Lundaborna kan börja använda den med en joggingslinga som ringlar fram här på den här nästan orientaliska mattan som vi ser framför oss. Det kommer finnas massa aktivitetspunkter här. Likaså i den här kunskapsparken som vi har börjat bygga, är klar om 3 år. Och den är hela 21 hektar stor. Och här kommer det finnas ett stort inslag av stadsodling, men också vattenspeglar och dammar och joggingrundor, möjligheter till det, och ridstigar och cykelvägar med mera. Allt för att man ska kunna leva ett aktivt liv i Brunnshög. Ja, hur tar man sig runt i Brunnshög då? Jo, cykeln har prioritet, men också gåendet. Så här har vi gator som man kanske skulle kunna kalla för lekgator. Här är det på riktigt som det ska vara kul att cykla och gå och leka, och vi tillåter bara behörighetstrafik. Så det här är också ett sätt som vi kan bidra till levande gator och städer. Att göra livet mellan husen roligare genom att få bort bilar naturligtvis. Samverkan med föreningsliv. Brunnshögs kojskog. Här finns material för 24/7 kojbyggande på eget initiativ, men också kurser och gemensamma workshops i kojbyggande. Stadsodling, också föreningsdrivet. De kom redan 2013 upp till Brunnshög och satt igång, och nu kommer de alltså få ett stort område i vår nya kunskapspark. Så det här är konkreta exempel på vad Lunds kommun gör för att göra det mer till en levande stad. Events är en självklar del också. Här har vi kulturnatten i Lund som arrangeras varje år. Där vi också har haft konstutställningar inne i kojskogen som har blivit permanenta. Och det är också roligt att se att när det blir ett stort gehör för en aktivitet, då kan det permanentas, då kan det bli kvar. Ja, det här är några exempel på hur vi konkret ute i kommunerna kan arbeta med att skapa en mer levande stad och levande gator.
Tack så mycket Eva, väldigt intressant. Nu ska vi gå vidare, och det knyter an på ett ganska naturligt sätt till föregående talare, framförallt när det handlar om just det med promenadstaden och vem vi planerar städer för. Det är ju faktiskt så att under de senaste 100 åren så har vi planerat städer framförallt för bilar. I will now go over to English because the next speaker is, he's not that good in Swedish, I would say. Not yet, at least. He will be. But anyway, I have, in my role as Arkdes think tank, got involved in a project around mobility and how we are actually planning the streets from the humans and not necessarily the car as a norm. And we call that project Slow Streets, Fast Cities. Sorry, I had to remember it. But what is very interesting with that is that we are kind of experimenting, we are testing, we are allowed to use the street as a sketchbook. So we are kind of inventing while we are, working with these new prototypes for how we can reinvent the usage of the streets. So the next speaker is no less than Dan Hill from Vinnova. He works as a strategic designer on Vinnova, director of strategic design on Vinnova at Vinnova. So welcome up, Dan.
Tack så mycket. And yes, my Swedish is terrible. I apologize for that already. I've been here 18 months and I should know better by now. But you all speak such good English. So yes, I'm a director of strategic design at Vinnova. My background is design. I'm originally an interaction designer, service designer, and then became a strategic designer and then worked for many years effectively in urban design and urban strategy all over the world and now in Sweden. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Let's see if these slides work. Let's get the first one up. Is it there? Next. Okay. So, we're going to talk about this project that we're doing at Vinnova. My role there is to invent and test new innovation strategies and approaches, and to do that in collaboration and deep participation right across the system, not working from sectors or silos or traditional understanding, but working in a way as things as they are, as Daniel implied, from the street up, if you like. So let me scroll back a little bit to show some history. This is Enskede in Stockholm, about 1907. This is the plan for Enskede. And it was a garden city, as many of you will know, brought into Sweden at that point and interpreted in this place. And as you can see, it's full of very, let's say, human and biodiverse streets. Actually, there's not much wrong with it as a plan. We could look at it now through contemporary eyes, and you see a huge amount of value there. But then, if we can play the video now, we'll show what happened next. So this is a film from 19...
Hur kan pappa och mamma tillåta någonting sånt där?
I think
Det är sannolikt att ställa höga krav på bilförare, eller bildrullarna som väl pappa och mamma helst kallar dem, ända tills de får tillfälle att skaffa sig bil själva.
Just a bit. Those are kids playing in the street. This scene...
Nej, men se här har vi gamla här Stockholm. Alla chaufförer ser...
This is talking about a guy called Mr.
Han
Stockholm.
lever fortfarande i den tron att han stoppar all trafik om han vill
This
genom att
awkward
stänga upp
interplay
sina
of
knubbiga
the
karlar.
traffic coming into the city at this point. And effectively, we can describe this almost as a propaganda. The streets are now for cars. All of this previous stuff, kids playing in the street, people walking fluidly, stepping into the street like this, that has to stop because the cars are coming. And you can see this, of course, is happening all over the world at this point. Whoops, almost making the case that those days are over. We, in a way, are now trying to look at this again and say, well, why can't the street be a place for two women to have a chat in the middle of it, or kids to play in it, or indeed have trees growing and gardens? And so on. So let's skip to the next slide if I can. So what happened then in Städer, if we just move ahead, is this, Nunasvägen, the state road, I think 1957, coming through the middle of it. Again, on the back of that film 20 years previously, we're able to make this kind of so-called progress. And you can actually see there, if I move to the next one, you can see this really slices the neighborhood of Enskede up. Those are the natural sort of flows that I've drawn on there originally. These were the places where you're supposed to connect to. Nunasvägen comes through the middle of it and stops all of that straight away. And of course, this happened all over Sweden and all over the world. And now if you look at the place like this now, this is a kind of a place you should be able to move through, and you're hitting directly actually a 6 or 7 lane freeway right there. And by 1955 or so, Sweden had the highest density of cars in Europe. So this has kind of been baked into the way that we've been doing things for a long time. So my job, again, is to sort of step back from that and say, well, the technology is a car. In this case, the technology is also things like Uber and Airbnb or smartphones or elevators. All of those things are technology. Technology is almost anything that we've made. And there's a case that we often do not think about that carefully enough when we're deploying it. So I borrow this quote from Cedric Price, my compatriot, English architect in the 60s, who said, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And what he was really saying there was, okay, the car exists, but let's at least have a conversation about how Stockholm or Malmö or Göteborg or Västervik should move around. What is the place about first? Then we can have a conversation about the car. That didn't happen, as you all know. So, and we see it not happening again. This is the so-called smart city movement, which is again sort of driving technology through. And we know that if that isn't done holistically, it's deeply problematic. Uber and Lyft, which in theory are smart solutions, actually increase traffic congestion by as much as 40% in somewhere like San Francisco. The same in every city they move to. Not to point then out in particular, Airbnb has the same impact on rents in cities like Barcelona with already unaffordable housing. So to be very, very careful about this and approach this holistically. Often architecture doesn't, unfortunately, consider these technologies as part of their toolkit. I'd argue that they should. So what we're testing here from an architectural point of view is, can we look at this more holistically? Can we as Vinnova actually put projects on the table that enable us to test these new ways of working? As Daniel said, use places almost as a sketchbook. And the sketchbook analogy is an interesting one. I hadn't really thought of it, but it implies the question, who's holding the pencil there? And so this is what the street mission is about. So this is something Vinnova is facilitating. It's building on lots of work being done in Kommuna and Region all over the country already. We're doing this heavily in partnership with people like Arkdes and others. And the goal is, if you like, say, okay, we have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as we just heard from Eva. The question is, how do we get there? Those are done, sort of signed and sealed politically. Same with the Paris Climate Change Accord. The question is now how. So we know we have to change our streets. The question is how. So we hold, okay, every street in the country should be healthy, sustainable, and vibrant, as in living in some way, whether it's biodiverse or full of kids, either way. And healthy and sustainable again. It has to do those things. We can't just pick these streets and not do it with these streets. All of them should be. And there's about 40,000 kilometers of street in Sweden. I believe we've actually built more parking space than we have residential space in Sweden. These are sort of things we have to work with, if you like, if you see that as a kind of a pre-installed infrastructure that we can use to test and shift in some way. So this is a heavy retrofit project. If we're able to do that, what kind of benefits might we accrue? So don't worry if you can't read all of the data points here. Just imagine if you change streets in this way, you're simultaneously solving multiple things at the same time. You're increasing air quality, you're increasing biodiversity, you're increasing urban heat island effect mitigation, you're increasing stormwater mitigation, you're also decreasing brain cancer, you can decrease domestic violence even in these same kind of ways, you can increase footfall into shops, all kinds of things are possible. All of that research exists, it all sits in silos and pockets. The health researchers, as you know, don't often talk to the sustainability ones, and they don't often talk to the planners and so on. So we need to bring those things together. The health of the street is connected, the sustainability is connected to the social fabric at the same time. So we take this very simple diagram of almost like before and after here. On the left-hand side, if you give the street to Trafikkontoret, with all due respect to my friends at Trafikkontoret, traffic is what you get. The clue is in the name, really. If we gave the streets to gardeners, you'd get gardens. But at the moment, we've optimized streets for traffic flows. If we put multiple things into that thing called the street, the diagram on the right, if we put in health, we put in business, we put in sustainability, we put in social fabric and so on, as well as traffic, we can pull out multiple outcomes at the same time. It really unlocks the richness of what the street is as a system. And we've done some mapping there of, the complex system diagram. You don't need to worry about that too much unless you want to come and talk to me afterwards, but how these things are connected. So then, of course, what we're doing is we're doing this in a participative way. So we've worked that through very carefully with as much diversity as we can. In the picture there, you might see companies like Voi and Arkdes at the same time as Stockholm Städer, at the same time as Citizens, at the same time as a health researcher, all working in the same way, all producing in the end what we did, these drawings that came out of this stuff. None of this stuff is rocket science. You can imagine the kind of things that people might come up with. Of course, there's some surprises in there, but that stuff is quite self-evident. So now we're working very closely with Arkdes in their role as a think tank. And they, in turn, have commissioned industrial designers, Levande, to start working on, so how would we begin to transform the street piece by piece, almost parking space by parking space. These already exist again. They're an addressable structure that already exists in the Swedish society and cities. So this becomes the idea of a sort of a kit of parts that can extend and fill as they go. Simultaneously, we have a project called Gator, which is working with White Architecture, Spacescape, Sweco, and Stockholm Stad and others. They're working at the same time with school children to help them redesign the streets outside the front of their school. So this is kids working with exactly the same kit of parts approach that we were previously working with Stockholm, Städer, and Arkdes, and Voi, and Volvo, and others. We've also done this with other people. I won't say who is better at this exercise. I'll quickly move on from that. But the kind of things you get out of that are actually really lovely. Of course, if you let kids design the street outside their school, they have an intuitive understanding of actually a healthy, sustainable, and vibrant street. That's what kids design for. And the same principle, as many of you will know, if you work with 80-year-olds, you'll get the same kind of outcomes as 8-year-olds actually quite often. And all of them are heading in this direction here. So this is working from the ground up in practice. So these have then been transformed into plans in Stockholm, and these are the streets that they're working on in the first instance, 4 streets to begin with. And simultaneously, as I said, we've started working with the kit of parts, which will start fitting into those streets. So on the one hand, we have this highly participative design process running. And please, if anybody that is from a commune or a region and wants to join, just get in touch. This is an open proposition. And at the same time, we're working with the kit of parts. The idea here is almost like it's an urban boardwalk, as this picture shows. It's kind of a slice-by-slice wooden structure produced with cross-laminated timber, we hope, through a computer-aided manufacturing process to make it actually very scalable and cost-effective at the same time as softening the landscape of the street and increasingly building the city out of wood, which many of you, again, will know is a good idea generally. So imagine this like the kit of parts, which can flex and grow to the spaces as they fit. They have particular applications in there, e-commerce delivery, battery charging points, e-scooter drop-off points, tons of greenery and so on. And they're being now deployed. I think maybe September the 17th, we see the first ones of those. So finally, this fits, of course, into what many cities around the world are doing now. Paris, perhaps most famously, with their 15-minute city at the moment. Again, these are not new ideas necessarily. In fact, we might argue this is how cities used to work before we did all that stuff with Nunasvägen in 1957, or the film in 1935. So in a sense, we're unlocking the natural capabilities of cities here. This is the 15-minute city idea from Paris. It also, of course, is highly interesting right now. Black Lives Matter movement in the US has played out on the streets. So I should say, not just in the US, across the world, actually. And this is a great quote from one of the organizers in Seattle saying, it's one thing to take a space, as we can do with the parking space, but it's another to make it into a function serving the community. That's the really powerful thing here, the decision-making being done by the street itself. A totally new role for kommun, region, and myndigheter in that relationship. We're a facilitator, but the street itself decides what happens there, and they get to modify the kit of parts and build out the street together. So Black Lives Matter is also pointing out the street is made for politics. The street is made for culture, for commerce, conviviality, community. The street is not really about traffic. Same as that, there's this very small political things happening as well. This is a movement in the UK where people are chalking on the street the plants that are growing there, the biodiversity in the street itself. This is actually illegal in the UK to do this. So it's simultaneously a bit like Black Lives Matter, but with a very different instinct. So about how the street becomes a platform for biodiversity is, of course, incredibly interesting. And again, how participative this can be. Can communities share the maintenance in this way? Can they look after the street themselves? If it's gardens, absolutely. If it's their gardens, even more so. And then the commune comes in and does the heavy lifting maintenance. These are new kind of relationships we might be able to broker in this project. And this really plays to the ideas that Linda Tegg, the artist, provoked at Arkdes recently. How does something like an urban meadow appear in the urban environment? In a sense, I like the project that we're working on to think of how could meadows and forests come back into cities? How do we reforest cities occasionally? We can only do that with people on board. And again, finally, this is what happens in cities all over the world anyway. This is Tokyo, whereas you know there's been no on-street parking in Tokyo since 1956. And the kind of streets you get out as a result are humane and biodiverse at the same time. So I'll leave it with that. Just some very, very quick final points. The kind of slowdown or lockdown that COVID has produced actually gives us a chance to reposition streets around climate resilience, human and non-human health, and this social justice question. Those are far better things to optimize cities around. But the way that we have to do that is incorporating all of the disciplines together and everybody involved in this process. That way we can begin to talk about the 1-minute city, the 15-minute city, the 30-minute city, but in all of that, that's something that we have to do together. That's what we're working on with Vinnova now. Very happy to talk to anybody about that afterwards. It's an open project. Please join. Tack så mycket.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I will say that this project that Dan also told you a little bit about, that I'm lucky to be involved in, is so interesting. And one thing that I take with me from Dan's speaks is the collaboration in between architects, designers, and also a lot of other disciplines. Next speaker is Johanna Tysk. Johanna will tell us a little bit about her thoughts on what is needed to make the transition to fully reach the goals that has been stated in the gestaltad livsmiljö politics. And Johanna, I have to read this because it is very complicated, her title. She worked with organizational relative cultural preconditions and have specialized in system-oriented design. And she works with her own company, Coco Labs, and for Linköpings universitet. And she now also then work with Helsingborg Stad through Linköpings universitet. Yeah, you understand. It's hard to explain, but welcome up, Johanna.
Thank you very much. Yes, it is a little complicated, and I'm going to do this in English so that Dan can understand and maybe comment a little bit on what I shared after. Let's get the slideshow started first off. Let's see. Yes, okay, so the topic that I'll speak on is the policy of gestaltad livsmiljö and transformational learning, which is sort of the main thing that I'm working with in Helsingborg City with Linköping University. And I can also mention in terms of my background, I'm from Stockholm and I recently moved here to Malmö from New York. So there's a whole bunch of cities involved in my life and practice. But in New York, I studied something called transdisciplinary design, which it's pretty much creative strategic ways of addressing complex problems across sectors. So I'll be sort of expanding on some of what Dan mentioned about systems-oriented change and transdisciplinary collaboration. So my background is not in architecture or city planning, but rather in, it's a broad background in design, art, and community innovation. So I'll speak more in broader terms in terms of collaboration and co-creation and what it might take to get that going. So if we look at the policy around gestaltad livsmiljö, so this is a quote. It's highlighted that giving form to a sustainable living environment is about organizing complex and sometimes conflicting interests into a whole. So further collaboration, co-creation, of course, is emphasized between sectors and government offices, but also involving citizens. So generally, you could say that co-creation is easier said than done, and especially with a lot of traditional planning processes in place. So this is sort of an illustration of what traditional planning approaches generally look like. And the way it goes is normally that a particular issue is analyzed from a particular perspective. It could be a certain discipline, it could be a certain sector, a certain department. Then you identify a solution based on this analysis and you implement the solution. And then sometimes there's an evaluation at the end. But a lot of times these kinds of evaluation doesn't ask questions like how do we broaden our understanding of this issue, or what are the perspectives that we missed along the way. There's a linearity to this that makes it sort of top down, and a lot of times trying to fit collaboration and co-creation into traditional planning approaches can be a challenge. So in contrast, what I would introduce here is what we need to create conditions for co-creation is to engage in iterative approaches. So this is where we explore an issue from multiple perspectives. And then we use this sort of multi-level understanding to understand and generate possibilities, and then we test our way forward. So there's a continuous learning loop involved in these kinds of processes. And some essential questions are like, how can we allow practice, unexpected stakeholders, or changing circumstances to continuously inform our understanding of a particular issue or site? Or how can we creatively shape and engage with the reality that surrounds us, rather than imposing our ideas about what the world should be like? So within a whole range of fields, everything from architecture, city planning, policy, healthcare, social work, the arts, we see more and more co-creative labs or projects set up, or sometimes emerging more spontaneously. And many times these are initiated or involve organizations with a sort of centralized setup, or very siloed between different departments. And this is sort of the default mode of most organizations, and based on sort of answers rather than questions, but that engage in trying to find new ways to collaborate together. So in my earlier career, I've been involved in these types of projects on multiple occasions as a designer and an artist. So these are images, examples from a co-design project where I engaged mothers and children in the design of a new social practice. And this is an image of where the project ended up about a year after, with the walls painted over and the objects and furniture made, replaced with standard things with no connection to the area or its people. And you might ask, like, what happened here? And I think what we see here is an example of the risk that you take with sort of experimental or co-creative projects when this kind of approach is not anchored in the overall strategy or vision or practices of the organizations involved. So the risk being that the sort of effort and output that's been mobilized, as in this case, that it sort of pretty quickly returns to the status quo, or business as usual. And I think throughout my years of being engaged in citizen-driven innovation, this is unfortunately, I've seen a lot of wonderful examples as well, but I feel like this is also an illustration of a pretty common dynamic. So what we see in these instances is, if we look at it as a feedback loop between the organization and the lab, that it only goes one way, that there's no learning involved. And what transformational learning is all about is creating a feedback loop between the lab and the organization, which is, it's really about facilitating a gradual transformation of the organization itself into a more cross-pollinating, more in tune with its surrounding environment. So an organization that asks as many questions as the answers that they come up with, and that has the capacity to grow and evolve. So ideally, this kind of learning would happen across sectors and actors, responding to a particular issue. It could be organizational entities, but also looser sort of citizen groups. And questions to ask can be, how can we understand ourselves as an ecosystem and adjust our roles in relation to one another to serve a shared purpose that draws from the strengths of our particular bubbles, but enables the resilience and innovative capacities of the whole system. So my testing ground for exploring some of these things moving on is a project called Den utforskande staden, or the researching city, in Helsingborg. So this is a project initiated by the Research and Development Office. Contains 5 hypothesis labs that brings researchers, different city offices and residents together to explore different themes. And one of these happens to be gestaltad livsmiljö. So when we're working with transformational learning, it's really about taking a deeper dive into the conditions for co-creative work across these types of boundaries. So if we look at it as an iceberg, we can see that one layer on top, which is like what happens in the lab. And then if we go underneath this layer, we discover a web of relationships and roles. So I sometimes call this bubble dynamics between different actors that create conditions for the work. The questions being like, what are the relational dynamics that enable or disable a particular sort of creativity in the top? And then underneath this, we find systems conditions that uphold these relationships. It could be rules and goals of the organizations, feedback loops, resources, mandates, formal roles, hierarchies. And then if we go even deeper down, that's where we find identities, narratives, beliefs, cultural paradigms even. So when we talk about systems change, it's really about sort of strategically operating between all these different layers. So from the very like intimate and personal, so what we see, what we feel, what we believe, to the very technical. So how have we built our physical systems, our organizational or political systems? So systems change obviously doesn't come easy. And there are multiple ways of exploring these kinds of systems dynamics. But one of them is design methodologies. So as in this case, through these objects, material objects, participants are given the chance to model their perspectives on relationships and elements tied to a set of actors. And through this kind of activity, you can give form to perceptions, to sort of tacit or embodied knowledge. You can compare and contrast different views. And you can also identify intervention points within these systems. And the advantage of working with design methodologies is also that you can work with this tension between sort of a current state and a preferred state. So you can explore futures or what ifs. You can look at sort of perceived movements within these systems. You can explore where you want to go or what the system needs, while pointing to system flaws and inadequacies. So hold sort of this totality. So part of my journey in Helsingborg will include a testing of structures for transformational learning. So learning for systemic change. How can it be facilitated? What kind of structures need to be in place? What actors need to be involved and under what conditions? So my site of investigation will be one of the hypothesis lab focusing on resident-driven innovation. So my work will involve exchange with the research group in Linköping, led by Stefan Holmlid, and also researchers at Lund University in strategic communication, as well as local actors. And finally, a quote that it's actually a Chinese proverb, but I learned it from systems thinker Peter Senge. And I felt that this was sort of appropriate also in an architectural context, and sort of encapsulates this kind of design-driven systems thinking, which says you cannot move a river, build a channel, and the river will move itself. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Johanna. That was also very interesting. So one question that I would ask to you, Dan. We have heard now about quite many like system changes that are needed to transform our streets, our cities, and I am wondering about that it is not only temporary changes that we are seeing, but how do we actually change things for real in this?
Yeah, it's As you can actually see also with COVID driving change around things, it's sort of, as we know, these changes were happening anyway, and there's been an accelerant there. Many cities have started using tactical urbanism tricks to already start changing the streets around them. The issue is sometimes they work, sometimes they disappear. Berlin put bike lanes in, but now deaths of cyclists have gone up in Berlin because the trucks weren't removed in the same time. So there's a danger with the very tactical approach. At the same time, they're very powerful because in your question, they do exert change right away, and they get us straight into the heart of the matter quite quickly. As Johanna was talking about, the real systems on the street have all of that complexity in them. So we're pursuing this kind of very place-based innovation because it holds the system complex, and yet it's super tangible, and every day it's very grounded. We can go straight to the street and unlock the whole project from there. To enable that to be strategic, it's precisely why Vinnova is involved, because we're involved in system change. That's, again, what we're trying to hit the SDGs, the policies that we've already signed up for. So we have a series of partners, including Arkdes, from the kind of Myndigheter level inside the government, Transportstyrelsen as well, the Transport Regulatory Authority, who they manage things like the parking space law, for instance, which is across the whole country. So while we are doing very tactical changes, you'd say small changes in a way which can begin to spread, by having the system on board, even the DNA of the entire system in those small changes enables us then to think about how do we horizontally translate that. If we change the parking space law, if maybe it needs it, it's from 1958 and we need to check, yeah. That unlocks across the whole country at the same time, more or less. So you enable a kind of a system change. You only get to that by doing some real work on the ground. That's not an academic exercise because it involves real people, real streets, real lives, real trees, all of those things. So it's balancing tactical and strategic. One without the other won't work. We won't do strategy without exerting real change as quickly as possible, and we don't do strategic unless we start with some of that work involving the rest of the agencies.
Very interesting and good final words, Dan. I would also say that we need to work more between architecture and design and a lot of other disciplines, much more within the gestaltad livsmiljöpolitics, and also outside of the big cities, small cities as well.
Absolutely.
And that is what we're doing, for example, in the Vinnova project now.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much for this, and thank you for this session, all of you that has participated. And yeah, that's all for us. See you.